Sean Diddy Combs has been arrested in a Manhattan hotel this evening after a grand jury indicted the music mogul.
Washington Post, just one question, did he or didn't he?
What are they now trying to do with these witnesses in order to prove the sex trafficking and racketeering?
Welcome to a special edition of the 25th Hour, the trial of Sean P.Diddy Combs, with your hosts, Bianca, Forde, and Alyse Adamson.
Welcome to another episode of the 25th Hour podcast, and our season has now come to an end because a jury has rendered a verdict in the Sean P.Diddy Combs trial, finding Combs not guilty of the three most serious charges and instead convicting him on the two lesser offenses. Bianca, I just have to ask right off the top, girl, were you surprised by this conclusion?
Was I surprised? No, for a couple of reasons. At the outset of this, Alyse, when we first started having this conversation, what was my question to you? Do you remember what it was?
Where's the RICO? Is that it?
Is it a RICO yet?
Is it a RICO yet? Yeah.
We were tracking it throughout the weeks that passed. And you know, there is a distinction between doing very, very bad things and a RICO case. And yes, two things can be true at the same time. Sean Combs did some really, really bad things. But when this case initially began, it felt different from prior RICOs. It was, an unprecedented use of the statute. And the government really made a strong case. Like, by the time we got to closings, the closing argument was so powerful. But at the same time, when you get to the elements of the charge, right, and the jury instructions, there is an instruction that basically says the acts should not be sporadic or isolated. And they've always felt sporadic or isolated, really more connected to the whims and the moods and the drug use of Sean Combs than some systematic, repeatable process that we've seen in other RICOs. So no, I was not surprised about the RICO. I was disappointed about the sex trafficking. And, you know, my fear, I wonder, right, where we would have been if there was no RICO. Would the jury have found the charges, including the sex trafficking charges, more credible, right? Because we know that when you overcharge, you risk nullification and you risk losing credibility with the jury. So no, I was not surprised.
Yeah, I generally agree with your take. My take on the sex trafficking, I think it was a very, very tough charge to prove in this case because there was a long-standing relationship and because there was evidence of prior consent. And juries are average people. You and I have a different perspective. We were prosecutors. We have seen sex offense, domestic violence. We understand the psychology behind this. We have that benefit. And I was thinking about this when people are questioning the victimhood of Cassie and Jane. I'm just dumbfounded. Like, how can you question these people were victims, these women? Because the defense opened admitting that he violently beat them. They called him a domestic abuser. So they are victims in any event, full stop. The question is, are they victims of sex trafficking? And the problem is the way the statute is written, it does not truly contemplate these situations. I think this is a function of not having enough laws on the books to address these types of situations. Sure. Because yes, I think technically it was sex trafficking, but in limited circumstances, because there were instances where they were freak-offs where she did consent, and there's a thin line between consent and coercion. And I think because you had these text messages that cast doubt in a criminal trial, as you know, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And when there is doubt, the jury has to find in favor of the defendant. So also, for people saying, I knew Combs was innocent, no. There's a difference between innocent and legally not guilty. He is legally not guilty because these charges did not perfectly fit his crimes, but he committed crimes. And I'll also say, and this may be an unpopular view, I don't think they should have added Jane. I think her fact pattern to the sex trafficking was even more of a stretch. So if they had just let Cassie stand, I actually think they would have had a better chance of a conviction if she stood alone. Her testimony was more powerful. Her life circumstances were very different. Yeah. And I think Jane was successfully crossed even more than Cassie. So I think she hurt them rather than help them.
So that's an interesting perspective. And I tend to agree with you. You may recall in one of our earlier conversations about this, one of my concerns was, look, we didn't know who Jane was at the time exactly. And my thought was, it's a stronger case if she is connected to the enterprise and not just a romantic interest. list. And you'll recall I was in court for Don Richard's testimony. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking, is she going to say that she was compelled to engage in sexual acts? Because the enterprise connection, even though it could be informal and it could be a group and you don't have to be employed by the same employer and all of those things, it just always felt as if this would be a stronger RICO if the sex trafficking victims were all connected to the enterprise. And Jane obviously wasn't. But one of the questions someone recently asked me is, who do you think won? And you and I have talked about this and how inappropriate that language is for criminal cases because it really minimizes all the things that are at stake. But, sitting here today, obviously this is a blow to the government. This is not how they wanted this to go after 7 weeks, 30 plus witnesses, many of whom were flown to New York to testify on the government's dime / taxpayer dime, right? This is not what the government wanted. But at the same time, I don't think Sean Combs is completely out of deep waters here, right? And what's coming next in this case is obviously sentencing. And there are a lot of reasons why his exposure is still pretty significant. What do you think about that?
No, that's true. I mean, first of all, I do think this was a win for the defense because we're going to talk about his exposure, but he's not facing the possibility of being in jail for the rest of his life. And in my mind, for the conduct that he committed, and again, I respect the jury's verdict. So we're talking about two different things. We're talking about what he was charged with and ultimately acquitted of, and then what there was evidence that he did, and even that his own lawyers conceded to. So let's just talk about the behavior that they conceded to, that he, over a long period of time, beat women, okay? The time he is facing now in no way matches his conduct that his own lawyers admitted that he did. He just wasn't charged with that, which I understand the argument is that was part of the problem with this case. All right, but I do think this was a major defense win for that very reason. Now, when it comes to his exposure, and also one other thing, it wasn't just the government that lost, it was victims, because now it's such a high-profile case, has had this outcome.
Yes.
Other prosecutors, victims don't understand the legal distinction of this was tough to try versus we have a tight case. They're going to say, look what just happened in New York. They're not going to put me on the stand. No, they don't care about women. They're not going to believe me. It is hard enough before this case, even after Me Too, where finally women were being believed, that didn't necessarily make it that much easier to get women on the stand. That made women more inclined to disclose their abuse. It is still very hard. You have to testify about the most traumatic, humiliating time in your life. So even if there is a conviction, the victim has been re-traumatized just sitting up on that stand. So I just want to say that this was a major loss. And I don't fault SDNY because I understand why they tried to bring this case. I do believe they thought this was a righteous prosecution. I think they made some strategic missteps and perhaps they were overconfident in their abilities. But I wonder if in their consideration, part of their analysis was the negative impact this would have on other sex-related violence cases if they lost. If they did do that analysis and they still were confident they were going to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, then negative outcomes happen in cases, and we are all just Monday morning quarterbacking. I would like to assume that they did do that analysis. If they didn't, that to me would be the problem. But again, SDNY is a very storied office. It is full of elite prosecutors and very mindful prosecutors. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt there. And bad outcomes happen. They really do. But to your point about Sean Combs' exposure, my understanding from some back-of-the-envelope math with the U.S. sentencing guidelines and from the government's own argument with his detention request, because Sean Combs was acquitted of the most serious charges, but his butt is still in jail because the judge still found him dangerous, right? There's actually a rebuttable presumption of detention at this point, which people don't realize. This whole narrative of, the judge is just trying to punish him because he got an acquittal. No! He was convicted of 2 crimes. And once you are convicted of crimes that carry a term of incarceration, the burden shifts to the defendant to prove why they should not be out. So his butt's going to jail no matter what. He's not probation eligible. People are saying that they don't know how the guidelines work. But his max at this point, with where he is on his guideline range, there is a handbook for judges on a bunch of factors, including criminal history score, the offense. Like I joke, you need an engineering degree to understand it. But that's what actually determines like the actual range that a person could be ultimately convicted of, or a judge can sentence them to. And so all this talk about 20 years, that's the statutory max. I looked. He has no criminal history. He's a 0 for criminal history. So he's what we call bottom of the guideline range. So the government is even saying top of his range is 5 years. Defense is saying we think that his range is really under 2 years. So when we talk about exposure, we're talking about half a decade, which again may sound significant, and I don't mean to diminish it because it's something. Combs is not walking out without additional time. But he's not doing the kind of time you would expect to see from someone who brutally beat people over the course of a decade. So I'm off my soapbox. But again, as a former prosecutor who stood on the side of victims, who tried to seek justice and ensure accountability for abusive human beings who get away with ruining people's lives over a course of several years in a pattern of criminal conduct, I am disgusted, quite frankly, that he's going to walk free. Not disgusted by the jury. It was the evidence, and there was a lot of evidence that could have been introduced that was not. I am disgusted by the circumstances that have led us here, that Combs couldn't be tried for the crimes he obviously committed. So I'm off my soapbox now, Bianca.
I hear you. So, if you look at the government's detention memo, they recognize that this is a preliminary calculation, and they even tease the fact that there might be 4 other points added due to the coercion, because the transportation to engage in prostitution overlapped with the allegations to some degree on the sex trafficking. So it's very possible that we can see the max go up to something like 8 years, and it remains to be seen whether this is going to be sentenced concurrently or consecutively, right? So from my perspective, that Judge Subramanian, sat through that entire trial. And one thing we have to recognize is, even though certain allegations were not proven beyond a reasonable doubt, that is not the standard for whether they factor into sentencing. There are a number of aggregating factors here that need only be proved by a preponderance of the evidence.
And that's a lower standard, just make it clear
standard.
For
that
people.
Means more likely than not. Is it more likely than not that he coerced these young women to engage in prostitution with these escorts, right? Is it more likely than not that he misused his special position as a manager in connection with both Cassie and Jane? Is it more likely than not that he obstructed justice, right? There are so many opportunities for aggregating factors to apply here. So when I say that I think he has exposure and significant exposure beyond the low level that someone with no aggregating factors and no criminal history would have, that is what I mean. And I just want to add one more point to this, because I think when people hear that there's no life sentence, all of a sudden all is lost. Let's just remember, as a nation, we are one of the most incarcerated nations in the world, especially in the first world, okay? And you don't need 30 years for it to be a real penalty. We have significantly fallen away from any other purpose of the criminal justice system other than retribution. For Sean Diddy Combs, 5 years is going to be substantial. And I guarantee even if he got 5 years, he would use every resource in his arsenal to appeal that decision and get less time. So his exposure right now, I could easily see him getting close to or above 10 years. And that is not nothing. In other parts of the world, that is the max, right? So for a moment, let's just change the lens on our glasses and recognize that a deprivation of liberty is significant, even if it's not life or de facto life of a sentence, right? And he's facing real time. It's going to be meaningful. And it's not just about the fact that there's no RICO. There are some real aggregating factors here that will enhance his sentence. And the government is going to argue hard for that. For that, I am certain.
They are, but he has a really great defense team. When it comes to coercion, that was ultimately I believe I think it's clear from the jury verdict was the problem, that there was a lot of doubt there. So we'll see if the judge finds by a preponderance of the evidence that there was coercion, because the jury certainly felt like there was questions, and there is real evidence of consent on a lot of these occasions. So it's a very tricky, nuanced analysis, and I do not want to be in the judge's shoes for that. I do want to say something about incarceration, because I hear you. I do. There are different reasons for a term of incarceration. Some of it is purely punitive. Sometimes when you are wanting to incarcerate someone for a long period of time, it is also for the safety of the community, because at that point there's no chance of rehabilitation. I'm not saying Combs can't be rehabilitated. I'm just saying there are certain rationale that goes into a sentencing recommendation of a long period of incarceration. So if I was asking for someone to be incarcerated for a long time, first of all, it was consistent with their sentencing guideline range. Their crime must have been very serious, because I personally do not believe in incarceration for low-level offenses, a lot of nonviolent offenses. I'm talking about violent offenses, okay? But at some point, somebody is so dangerous that they just, I understand they have a liberty interest, but they have offended in a manner that has demonstrated they cannot live safely within the community. And again, I'm talking broadly, because I know people are going to come after me in the comments. Oh, this is just Diddy and his relationship. Diddy not going out there. Actually, if you're a hip hop fan, these are just allegations. So I'm not saying that this is 100% true, but what we've been hearing since the 90s is that Diddy does use violence to solve his disputes. Diddy allegedly beat people up after the Hate Me Now video came out, with him still in the original edit, because he decided at the last minute he didn't want to be next to Nas with the cross because of the religious symbolism. I do believe he did settle a lawsuit in the 90s for beating another executive. This man has a pattern of violence. So at a certain point, in certain circumstances, enough is enough, and it's not just punitive, it is a safety measure. So I just want to say that, like, and this is why sentencing is so personal to every single person who is before the court. Every human being, and I have a lot of empathy for defendants in these positions. And this is why we'll have to do another pod on why AI should not really form a greater basis in sentencing. And Bianca did a wonderful class. Here's a shout out to my co-host who teaches a wonderful class at American University. And this was a topic, because you need a human being to understand all of these things. But this is why I'm not saying Sean Combs deserved life in prison. But I do think if Sean Combs is able to walk out with essentially time served, where he only does a couple of more months because he gets a concurrent term, and just so people know, concurrent means he's convicted of 2 crimes with 2 separate penalties, but they can run those penalties together. So if he gets 2 years on one and 2 years on the other, the judge can put them together and he can serve those 2 years together. Or the judge can run them consecutively, which means back to back, which means he gets 2 years on this one, 2 years on this one. He's doing 4. So there is a outcome here where he does under 2 years. He will have already served a year because he gets credit for the time he's been sitting in jail, and he only does another year. And to me,
that's not happening. There was no way
I'm saying that
happening.
but the point is, Bianca, for me in the conversation, that is a possible scenario, even though, because of everything we know, because of the evidence at trial, it is highly unlikely. The reality is, due to the acquittals, it is an argument that the defense can make. And to me, the conduct in this case, it is extremely disturbing that we find ourselves in these positions. But again, it's not because truly of a failure of SDNY, or truly because a jury verdict should not be respected or wasn't correct, because I think it was. I think it's because there's a failure of the system to provide larger statute of limitations, for instance, so we can bring these types of aggravated assaults when they finally come to life, instead of rich people bribing folks, right, to keep them hidden. And so when they finally come to light, they can say, sorry, nothing we can do, which is what the defense did. And they put it on the government. The government didn't bring these charges. The government didn't bring these charges because your client paid to have them buried. That's why the government didn't bring it. So I just want to be clear.
But let's talk about that. And you raise an interesting policy issue, but there are provisions within, particularly even bribery, which is the example you just alluded to, where if there are efforts to conceal, it does allow for an extension of the statute of limitations. Now, I have not done the analysis. I like the way you put it before. Let's give SDNY the benefit of the doubt in terms of having performed that analysis. But I'd be curious, right? Because there are potentially some other crimes on the books that would not have furthered or supported a life sentence like the RICO would have, and strategically, maybe that's why the RICO was chosen. When you think about the fact that bribery, for instance, allows extension of the statute of limitations when there's concealment, sex trafficking, right, allows extension because the policy is built into that statute. Recognizing.
But a lot of his crimes were state-level crimes. The problem is, like, beating Cassie in California is not a federal crime unless there's other hooks. It's a state crime, right? And so we're talking SDNY is the federal government. There has to be an interstate element. So I think that was also the problem, that some of these things he's doing, they couldn't bring. And
well, they may not have been able to bring his charges, but pattern, method, modus
operandi, yeah,
right, modus operandi. Been a minute, but like you said, we're not Monday morning quarterbacking the government, but I agree with you on a couple of points, right? I think there could be an absence of statutes. I think there may have been some that were just not as attractive because the exposure was not significant, and that takes us back to the point I was making, which is sometimes we need to think about, in the space of criminal justice, right? There's what can we do and what should we do. And that what should we do shouldn't necessarily be driven by what the penalty is, right? Like, it shouldn't all be about securing the highest possible period of incarceration ever. Because sometimes when the optics fail in situations like this, the broader implications, and we talked about this the first conversation we had, what will happen here if this turns out to be an overuse of the RICO? The general public is not going to understand that this failed because RICO was just not the appropriate charge. It is going to be interpreted, and I've seen it all over the internet already, all over Instagram. The government not the government, but people don't care about women. People don't care about sex crimes. I don't feel safe, right? All over the internet already, and that is a very significant risk that we are dealing with right now.
Totally agree. And I just want to be on record to make it clear that I don't ever think that a charging decision should have to do with putting the charges that would carry the highest penalty. That I agree with you 100%. I was just saying that for the conduct that was admitted to by the defense, I don't think that what he is facing is appropriate, but that conduct wasn't charged.
I thought it was interesting that the judge used the defense's words against them, right? I want to pull up the quote. I believe it was, we own it. We own the domestic violence, right? And it was interesting. He was never going to get out on bail. You had a request from Cassie's lawyer indicating that Ms. Ventura believed that she was in danger if he was released. As there was also a letter from Mr. Nash, right? Really emphasizing how important it was to keep Mr. Combs detained in this environment. And there were no exceptional circumstances, right? I love the fact that the defense was like, his family is here. He put his Miami home. He fully paid $48 million to own his Miami home free and clear. So that, he could show that he was not going to skip bail. I have his passport. He has a 2.5-year-old. The judge was like, none of that is exceptional. Please go sit down, sir. You are subject to all of the requirements of the criminal legal system, even though you're a multimillionaire / potential billionaire, whatever. I don't know what his financial status is. But, I think, and we were talking about this before we signed on today, the fact that the defense has asked and the parties are going to align to figure out if they can move his sentencing date up. And tell our viewers, Alyse, a little bit about what needs to happen in this process, right? Like the process for getting that sentencing memo done and that PSR, the pre-sentencing report. That takes time.
It takes time. So we keep talking about what these guideline ranges are, right? And again, it's that handbook that it is now considered advisory and not mandatory. But judges follow it, right? And they do it because that way they can say there's a uniform metrics they're using it. It's supposed to ensure more fairness in sentencing. Okay, but to do the calculations, we keep talking about, I'm not sure, or it could be 8 or aggravating factors. You have to do the analysis. To do that, U.S. probation does something called a pre-sentence report. They're going to interview Mr. Combs. They're going to learn about his backstory. Because remember, we said each defendant is different. He gets to tell his story too. He doesn't have to admit to the crime, but there are certain social factors that go into this analysis as well. Of course, the government is going to present their side of the story. The defense attorneys are going to present theirs, and then they're going to engage in a complicated calculation, and that takes time. Usually, at least in the cases we had, sometimes it could take several months to get this pre-sentence report done, because you know what? The pre-sentence report writers are busy doing that for all federal felonies unless it can be waived, which means they don't get the report. It can be waived in cases where the parties decide kind of what the sentence is going to be. But here we need all those calculations. The judge needs to know what the range is. They need to know what range are we playing in here for. That takes time. So I appreciate that Mr. Combs wants to have finality in this case, to understand how long he's going to be in prison. I'm a defense attorney now. I don't want this, we're talking about this case really from the government's perspective, but I would want my client to have finality. But my client is no different than any other defendant in the criminal justice system facing time and currently incarcerated. And guess what? As you said, we have a very high incarceration rate in this country, and most of them are very low income Black and brown individuals. So why is the dude who's poor, right, locked up next to Mr. Combs, needs to wait 2 months for his sentencing to get that on the calendar, and Mr. Combs is somehow different, and probation should be sitting in a back room feverishly doing his calculations.
Burning the midnight oil.
Burning the midnight oil so he could get this over with. Like, he's not above the law. He's not above the system. And he's going to get credit. So for any time he's sitting in jail waiting for this sentencing, he's going to get credit back, and he's not getting out immediately. So I don't know what world they think that rushing sentencing is going to somehow benefit him in terms of how much time he's serving. Now, if he wants to know and get it over with, I can appreciate that. Like, that is something very heavy on people's minds. But I was like, let them cook. They got to, and for his sake too, don't you want them to do a thorough job to make sure they get this right?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think?
Happens? It looks like they'll be back in court on July 8th. The parties have been asked to look at their own schedules and to propose a few dates that are ahead of October 3rd. So it looks like the court's trying to accommodate. The prosecution is also trying to accommodate. So we'll see what happens. And I'm certain this is technically the last episode of the season, but I'm certain we will bring you all a bonus episode when it comes to sentencing, so we can talk a little bit about that and what happened, or maybe some predictions right before, even though I think you got most of our predictions today.
I'm clearing my calendar for September, Bianca.
Yeah,
we're going to do this. We're going to do this.
Yeah. Well, I hope you like what you heard. Hit subscribe so you know when our next season / bonus episode on Diddy is released. We love being here with you all. We hope you're enjoying it as much as we are. And see you next time.